Welcome back to Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum show committed to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, no doubt known to you all, Eric Kaufmann, political scientist, professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, and the author, most recently, of TABOO, How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. Now, Eric, thank you very much for joining Connor and me today. We'll do some rudimentary election stuff first, and I suppose I'll begin by asking you that the new Labour government has come in and said that the culture war is effectively over. Do you think that this is a covert way of them gloating about the fact that they believe they've won it?
Well, I actually think more than that, it is actually a way of them trying to get attention away from criticism of the cultural revolution that's being waged by activists within institutions. You look at Lisa Nandy's speech, for example, where she was essentially removing Esther McVeigh's ban on rainbow-colored lanyards and other sort of LGBT paraphernalia, let's call it, in that department. The aim of that talk is essentially she's suggesting that bringing pride insignia to work is not the culture war, but banning that and saying that everybody should be politically neutral and we should only fly the government flag is the culture war, right? So it's a neat way that they've reframed that, but I think the strategy for Labour is very much going to be, let's try and keep the attention away from the culture war, and what that actually does is it green lights the culture war within the institutions. So Labour knows they don't actually have to do anything to advance the culture war agenda. All they have to do is make sure nobody else resists the culture war agenda being waged by their minions.
So you don't think they're going to do anything active at the level of legislation in order to entrench the purchase that racial, gender, and sexual politics already has within those institutions?
I think that they will make a few symbolic gestures. So yes, they will do some things, but I think it'll be quite limited. Now, they have talked about this race equality issue. They've talked about diversity in teaching history in schools. Mm-hmm. They're now talking about, mental health services, not, there being some kind of racial bias, which of course there isn't, but somehow because there's a disparate, impact in terms of who gets sectioned, that somehow reflects a kind of so-called structural racism.
Black people being more likely to be sectioned than whites.
So I think in and around the edges, they are probably going to, accelerate it. But I think the main thing they're going to do is essentially greenlight activists, because actually they don't have to do anything. I mean, this is the thing: is when your side controls all the institutions, they can prosecute the politics for you. And in fact, if you are actually directly associated with that, you might have to take scrutiny and flack from the press and be damaged amongst some of your voters. So actually, it's much nicer and cleaner if you just wash your hands of it and let your epigons go at it in the institutions.
This seems to me like pure Schmittian politics. It's using the pretense of being neutral to any given conception of the good, saying that we'll allow pretty much everything, laissez-faire lanyard wearing, in institutions, to then advance the aims of your particular protectorate groups. So they've got the LGBT constituency, they've got the race communist activists in BLM and the like, and they're saying, well, we won't actively prosecute you like the likes of Suella Braverman attempted to do and was stonewalled by Number 10, according to her recent speech at NatCon. But then that just means they are allowed to run roughshod over all of the institutional norms and an actual enforcement of neutrality, as you've proposed.
Yeah, because it's worth saying that you have to look at our starting point. So our starting point is not some kind of neutrality, or it's not some kind of place where what I call cultural socialism is on the back foot. I mean, they have essentially permeated all the institutions. They're very much setting the agenda. They are setting the ethos in these institutions. So they're in a very strong position. And in a way, the biggest threat would be if they got resistance from central government. They got sporadic resistance, ineffectual, to some degree ineffectual resistance, but they nevertheless understood that the likes of Oliver Dowden and Kemi Badok and other people were giving speeches against what they were doing. So they had to watch their step a certain amount. They didn't want to be in the press too much. Now, I think, essentially, the restraints are off. The leash is off, and the dog is loose. And so I think we're going to see these things kind of go up a notch and just become more entrenched. So, because the problem we have is in 3/4, and for 18-year-olds, it's almost 80% of schools, critical race and gender ideology is being taught. or adults that are coming and visiting the school and pushing that agenda. So that's already happening at saturation level. What we actually needed was a very aggressive pushback to depoliticize the schools. Now that's not going to happen. So I guess my view is, look, they've already won in a way, and so all they have to do is keep scrutiny away from the fact that they've won, and they are essentially setting the agenda. And yeah, so I think Labour, because Labour knows that, now there are a few little places where there were losses. So on the gender critical side, yes, when it comes to gender recognition, there I don't think they can do much because they're hemmed in. This has been politicized. You see, the thing is, whenever the issue hits the public consciousness, then it's much tougher for them to get their way, because 2/3 of the public, as I argue in the book, 2/3 of the public is opposed to the woke position. So it's very unpopular. So you've got this unpopular position. If you want to advance an unpopular position, what you want to do is get that under the radar, and you want to get attention away from that unpopular position.
So despite the unpopularity, are you falling on the side of, there's Oren McIntyre and Dr. Nima Parvini have a bet as to whether or not the elite are competent enough to put the woke away when it becomes radioactive. You're saying that they're not going to be smart enough to try and shelve it and selectively put it away. They're still going to advance the agenda, but they're just going to be slightly quieter about it.
Well, when the political pushback is significant, as it has been over gender recognition and women, biological males in women's prisons and those sorts of things, then they'll back off. And you'll get Tony Blair saying, you've got to tack to the middle of public opinion on this issue. So they will back off when there is a high political price. And so I think on the gender stuff, you can see that Labour has actually moved away from the extreme positions. The Lib Dems don't seem to have, but everybody else. And so, there is a discipline from electoral politics and public opinion, but that's only if the issue is of a high enough salience that it's making the headlines. So as long as Isla Bryson up in Scotland, as long as no one was paying attention, they could get away with it. So in Canada, for example, there's plenty of males in women's prisons because the media is entirely left-wing and there's no media to bring this to public consciousness. Here there is a media, it's more balanced media, so you are getting it in the public consciousness. The aim, however, on the race, so they have to bend on the gender stuff, but on the race stuff, what's happening in schools, that's not up the agenda. It's not in the public consciousness. We're not having discussions about critical race theory in British schools. So they can continue business as usual, and whenever anyone raises it, their aim is, we don't do culture war, we're just about the NHS waiting list.
But the point then, I suppose, would be that it's not so much ideological considerations which are causing some among the strategic left. Forget the rabid right. left, which is always going to be sort of emotionally and ideologically inconstant about its real beliefs. People like AOC, people like
Joy Reid,
right. who are just some people like to call it the id of the Democratic Party,
right.
like what they actually believe deep down. Among the strategic left, it's not ideological considerations which are causing them to take their foot off the accelerator. They're not putting the woke away in an ideological sense, but for reasons of strategic nous, they're trying to soft pedal a bit, just in order so as not to spook public opinion, and so that someone like Keir Starmer, rather than being incipiently threatening to 2/3 of the public, comes to be seen as some kind of sensible moderate with a nice smile and a nice suit, and
right.
Stands to the national anthem and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, you just look at the flip-flops people like Streeting and Starmer have done on these issues, right? And if they're twisting with the political wind. Now, I kind of almost don't mind that, in the sense that if we can get enough attention on an issue, then that will blow them back towards the center. But there is a question of, so if we're saying they're pragmatists, what happens if Starmer's approval ratings start to go down in the Labour Party's polling, and which they almost certainly will, which always tends to happen to parties in office. And once he loses that, his backbench, the sort of Angela Rayner kind of nutcase wing of the party, and let's face it, most people who go into Labour Party activism nowadays on the intellectual side they're going to be well educated, motivated by the cultural issues, and so there's bound to be incredible pressure if he's seen to be frustrating them, or if he's seen to be so-called conservative on these issues. Then I think he's going to increasingly get flack, and if he loses control of his backbench, then increasingly that momentum style, the alternative left is going to start to rise.
And as a result of that, we will see the culture war being prosecuted not only at the more hidden, more covert institutional level. Obviously, everyone notices that, but it's less immediately blamable on central government. We will see an intensification of that agenda in the corridors of power, in the corridors of governmental power, as well as in the corridors of institutional power, if institutional power has corridors.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's...
Well, if I compare, you have, say, Justin Trudeau at the extreme where it's overt, where he's essentially wearing the culture war on his sleeve. You then have Biden, who is sort of 60% of the way towards Trudeau. He's announcing, race equity in terms of assistance, government assistance in COVID and all these other things.
Only between the hours of 10 and 4.
Yeah, right. Now Biden, it looks like the Democrats have sort of backpedaled a bit on puberty blockers, and so they're very strategically backpedaling. But he's trying to change it from sex to gender on the discrimination side. So he's kind of playing all sides. But it just shows that if an issue can reach the public consensus, and this is the point about the culture wars. 2/3 of the public are against in Canada, Britain, and the US, where I've polled. It's a clear winner for any Conservative party that can get hold of it. Now, of course, the Conservatives have been useless in Britain and in Canada for a long time because they've been chicken of going after these issues for fear of being attacked as being divisive and stoking the culture war. And so the left's tactic has to always be, hey, you're stoking, you're dividing, put it away, put it back in the box. It's just unseemly, which you can read as let our activists get on with the culture war without any resistance. Yet it'll be interesting to see to what extent the media here on the right and the few Conservative and Reform MPs can shed light on this and unearth this issue. Will Reform be able to amplify these issues, and will some Tory MPs be able to amplify them and get attention on them? That's what they have to do, because the more they're in the public eye, then it'll no longer be possible for Labour to ignore. And I should say, you can see certain issues. I think gender is easier for the right to tackle. Like this idea of males in women's sports and women's locker rooms and prisons seems to be, that domino seems to be on its way to falling, even in Canada, believe it or not. I mean, not entirely, but to some degree. The race stuff is much, much trickier. Can we actually have a conversation about critical race theory in schools? Now, of course, Starmer's announced this thing about, diversity in the curriculum, right? So he's going to put that on steroids. And there's no question some of the legislation, the race equality stuff, is by creating a sort of duty to sort of record your employees by race and sex. That will create compliance pressure. I mean, that's kind of the Hanania thesis, that will create an atmosphere where, just to be safe, we're going to do DEI, just so that if we get sued, we can say we've done DEI and therefore we're not discriminatory, and that might tell in our favor in a case. Mind you, on the other hand, there's a mood in the corporate world now that is shifting against a lot of DEIs, even in Britain. So that's interesting.
Are you optimistic then about the Tory leadership contest? Because I've just got back from NatCon. Having watched Suella Braverman's speech, I thought it was exemplary, despite having criticised her for being too liberal at the NatCon UK event last year. And she is being sincere and reflective and said, why will we flying the Progress Pride flag over government buildings when I think it represents our failures on children's safeguarding? And the folks like Kemi Badenoch, who's in prime position to take over, said she's having a mental breakdown. The mouthpieces of the One Nation Tories turned around like Ian Dale and said, I will do everything in my power to prevent Suella Braverman from becoming leader. You've even had long-term allies like Danny Kruger defect to Robert Jenrick, thinking that he's the only way to head Badenoch as a containment candidate off at the pass. So as much as people like Badenoch have made decent noises on the gender issue, or she's debated Kimberly Crenshaw in person on critical race theory, do you think that an appointment of anyone except for Suella giving a full-throated condemnation of Tory's record is going to be sufficient to combat the Labour agenda?
It depends, right? I mean, it depends how serious Kemi is in terms of getting things done. And I think that's one of the criticisms is she's done excellent work in terms of the speeches. Can she see through this? Can she sustain a kind of DeSantis-style policy reform, get into the detail, and make it a priority? Or is there going to be that natural inclination to tack back to safer ground and just talk about the economy?
Go with nipping in her ear.
Yeah, and I think that's my concern is, do they care enough? Are they willing to be called a homophobe, a transphobe, stoking the culture war? I actually think now, for a politician to be effective, if they're not being attacked on these fronts, if they're not being regularly called a racist or transphobe, they're not doing their job properly. And there also has to be the policy follow-through and just being relentless in terms of combating the civil service lawyers and removing people if necessary. There's actually an interesting report, I think it's coming out soon with Policy Exchange, or it's just come out, talking about the fact that actually you can do a lot of stuff with the civil service if you're united as a party. It's that if you're divided as a party, and some ministers think some things and others do think the other, then the civil service can play you off and they can obfuscate.
And they will just wait until your rival ends up taking over that ministerial post, and so they'll keep quiet. So during Brexit, for example, in the Treasury, if Philip Hammond was in post, they would feel more secure than who was the one just before Philip Hammond? I forget, but you get the point.
Yeah, exactly. So you will really need a very focused government that's really focused on the cultural questions. And also, I think with the culture war, right now if you do surveys, you ask people what's the most important issue. Culture war tends to come relatively low. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, it depends how you ask the question. The aim of, I think, the next conservative government, if it's the right type of conservative, is going to have to be to get that salience higher up the agenda. The higher it is, the greater the chance you're putting Labour on the back foot and you're getting ahead on the votes. And of course, explaining why this really matters. If we can't have conversations because they offend certain groups, then we can't talk about immigration, we can't talk about schooling, we can't talk about crime, we can't talk about anything.
But one thing that could really raise its salience is to point out how it feeds into everything else that has salience.
Yes.
Like whatever 1, 2, and 3 are, there will be some kind of cultural war bearing on that, even things like the economy, because if capitalism, if children in schools are being relentlessly taught that capitalism is a fundamentally white supremacist structure, way of structuring an economy, then you don't expect to have a subsequent generation of voters who are really keen on Milton Friedman-style supply-side reforms. They just won't be if they've been relentlessly indoctrinated in that direction. So it's one of the things that I've been really struggling to understand why there has been this delayed reaction. That culture is treated as something sort of separate. It just exists in this kind of stratosphere up there, and you can take an interest in it if you want, and you can duck out of it if you don't want. The fact is that whether or not you are interested in the left's latest cultural maneuver, it's likely that the left's latest cultural maneuver is interested in you, it's interested in your pay packet, it's interested in what your children are being taught, it's interested in whether we are permitted to have a solid border. It necessarily feeds into all of these questions.
Well, yeah, that's why I always say the culture war is not just about culture. And it has all these, and there's a whole chapter in the book on downstream effects. And one of them, of course, is if you can't control immigration because that's seen as insensitive to minorities and therefore a violation of the taboo against anti-racism, this inflated anti-racism taboo, then you're going to have excess immigration, which means you can't deal with the housing problem. So all of a sudden, if you're worried about housing and NHS and all these other problems, you can't deal with those. And military recruitment is another one where if you have essentially whipped all the patriotism out of your young population, you suddenly want to recruit soldiers for military, or for if you want to recruit police, who's going to go into those fields when they've been so demonized?
And if you've relentlessly demonized the white male native population, which is probably at scale the group that you would expect to be most inclined to join the military.
That's right.
Because the deplorable, if you sort of demonize the deplorable class who are overrepresented, you're going to miss your military targets.
Yes, yeah.
That's the true in the United States, and it's true here as well.
Yeah.
But on that, recognizing that is itself always decried as being on the woke right. I mean, I recently watched your Unheard debate with Helen Pluckrose.
Right.
And she brought up that term. And we spoke on Lotus Eaters before about trying to nail this down and define it. And what it seems to be is that if people who are actively discriminated against, which is straight white males, take a defensive posture by saying all of the institutions, the culture, the law, actively discriminates against white people, for example, and that these host populations, when they have a national conscience, are the exact kind of people to populate a military and a police force and take care of civic institutions, and demonizing those people means they fall into a state of disrepair, you're automatically accused of wanting white racial consciousness. Or if you're saying we need to use state power to, as you insist, make institutions neutral, and we've had a back and forth on the possibility of doing that, even if you're pushing for neutrality, you're still accused of being on the woke right. So how do you fortify politicians' minds against, yes, being called racist, sexist, transphobic, but then have the wets and the liberals on their own side saying you're just like the woke, except on the right? Like, how do we do that? Because I don't see the courage there,
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to say, woke has a very specific meaning, and I mean, obviously define it as making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual minority groups. So, like the equivalent, if we were to say, whites are underrepresented in basketball, therefore the society is structurally anti-white. I mean, that is kind of the argument. Or I guess we could pick a profession that I'm trying to think of where, which profession whites might be. Maybe, I don't know, PhD students. PhD programs in the sciences are systemically anti-white. That would be the equivalent of being woke on the right? No, in fact, if, say, for example, there was blatant, if someone said, I'm proud to be black, and they were shouted down and accused of being racist for saying that, that would be the equivalent. But essentially, a lot of the claims say that Jeremy Carl makes, talking about anti-white racism, a lot of this would be to say, well, you're allowing groups A, B, and C to say they are proud of who they are and to want their group to thrive demographically, and then you're saying the reverse for whites. So
you're literally in prison if you say that for group D.
Right. So that is very clearly unequal treatment in the classical definition of racism as an individual level, hatred or superiority or discrimination. This is not some kind of argument around so-called structural racism. That's not the argument that's being made by the side that's flagging anti-white racism. It's just old-fashioned, individual to individual or institution on individual racism, unequal treatment based. So yeah, I think it's ridiculous. Now, you have certain family resemblances. So you certainly have, if you disagree that the election was stolen and you hope to be a Republican candidate, there's obviously certain cancel pressure on people who say that no, Trump lost the election.
Hey, right? I just read the Time magazine thing where they said there was a shadow campaign, Eric. I don't know.
Yeah. So, but that is not exactly what we mean by woke. I mean, yes, obviously cancellation is one aspect of, and peer pressure is one aspect of woke, but that isn't the core definition. So they're basically misusing the definition of woke to make this point about the woke right. Yeah, I think it's ridiculous.
It's completely ridiculous, and I think a much more solid definition of woke right would be someone like Kemi Badenoch, and namely someone who fights culture wars that code right wing, but plays into woke moral language in doing so. And Kemi Badenoch does this routinely, and this is one of the reasons why I'm very suspicious of her, and why I don't want to see. Well, I don't really care about the Conservative Party all that much, but
I can't vote in it anymore.
Having been cruelly expelled, can't vote in any case. Because she has the decency to deny that we're a systemically racist country. She has sort of regime-issued armor plate, which enables her to do that in a way that it doesn't enable me to do that, being a white person. So she has the decency to do that, but she will often cite as evidence that we're not a systemically racist country the fact that she has succeeded and that there are so many black people in central government, which is basically a concession. It's an implicit concession that diversity is not only a strength, but that if we weren't trumpeting diversity, we would be a racist country.
Yeah, and I think that's fair in a way. I mean, I guess the question for me, though, is not so much rhetorically whether she's done that or not. The question for me is always in the delivery. Is she going to have the stamina to face down the teachers' unions and the educational establishment and the civil service establishment and push through reforms such as, no progress pride flags, we're not going to do these identity months, we're not going to teach critical race and gender theory in schools and enforce it and fire people who do it, to the point that you get to a position that Florida is in, for example. That's what I will be looking for. And the question is, does she care enough about this issue to make it a focus of her administration?
Yes, so the stamina question is also important, but you can expend as much stamina as you want in the name of doing something that's wrong. It doesn't make it good. And if her methods and if her own moral language is constantly making concessions to the woke universe, to the woke moral order, then that's not a kind of winning that I'm interested in. I don't want to win on the left's terms. I want to completely overhaul their terms of debate.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you might call it a partial win. So you're pushing back on the so-called structural racism argument, but conceding to some degree on what I would call the modernist diversity claims around the virtue that diversity is always better than commonality. So yeah, I think that's not ideal. I don't know, but I suspect in her own mind, I just don't know to what extent she's fully signed up to this idea that diversity is better than commonality. I'm not sure she's actually thought deeply enough about that question. So I could imagine she might contradict herself in another speech. So to me, the bottom line really would be to what degree is she going to really prioritize culture in her premiership if she actually got the job.
Yeah. In any case, I still think that would be a better definition of woke right than the one that's often wheeled out. And you have these sorts of very complacent, sort of what we might call kind of 1990s left liberals who basically who are quite sensitive in the face of woke because they're not really particularly in favor of these kind of newfangled dogmas around race, gender, and sexuality, and they're not very attracted to some of the left's more strident recent methods, and so they're kind of spooked by it, these kind of 1990s liberals. But they also have they're also petrified at the thought of being equated with conservatives in some way. They will often say things like, "I didn't leave the left left me." You get these sorts of statements coming out, and it's almost as if they're only willing to address the problem of woke ideology within their own narrow liberal paradigm. And people who come along outside that liberal paradigm and maybe say that there are certain aspects of left liberalism, as you do, that have enabled wokeism to thrive, those people get dismissed as woke right. But the problem is, even if people like Bill Maher were to rewind us back to the 1990s, and we wouldn't necessarily stay there in that state of seemingly apolitical neutral bliss. We would probably find ourselves in exactly the same position 20 years later.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think this is where, my argument is really the left liberalism has got us here, and the cultural Marxism may have accelerated a little bit, but it is somewhat incidental to the story. So it's a bit like, so the difference, if Ibram X. Kendi says we need perfect equal representation in every institution, and there should be a amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
Which he does.
And he says this is all because there's structural racism, and, so that would be a kind of cultural Marxist argument. But you take the left liberal argument, is we're too white, we're too male, we need more diversity. It's not fair for black people or for women. We know that. So that is what they say. There's this open-ended view like we need more diversity, equity, inclusion. They don't say, oh, and by the way, here's the boundary when we know we will have reached enough diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's just we need more. So it's this open-ended thing. And this is why I say multiculturalism is a gateway drug to critical race and gender ideologies. In fact, because it's open-ended, you can just evolve and push on those boundaries and push and push and push. And so what we see is this metastasizing and evolutionary, I'd call it a stochastic extremism coming out of left liberalism, where it's every generation taking it to the next level, and then they find themselves converging with the cultural Marxists.
And just one detail as well.
Yeah.
It's funny, since you mentioned Ibram X. Kendi and I just mentioned Bill Maher as well. Bill Maher is on record as saying that it should be celebrated as progress, the fact that the ethnic English have been reduced to a minority involuntarily without their consent in London. He said that's progress. The fact that the white British population of London has declined so precipitously, that is actively progress. He says that.
Well, yeah, and that comes down to the celebration of diversity,
Indeed.
equity. I mean, they want more. They just don't throw a quota around it and say there's a structural discrimination. So yeah, I think they wind up in the same place.
They don't disagree with the destination, only the route taken and the rate at which the car is going.
Yeah.
So to pivot on that, I mean, America's come up a few times, I suppose, in the last little bit of this discussion. Obviously, on Saturday, Trump was nearly killed.
Yes.
And there has been a lot of hand-rubbing glee from the TikTok and Twitterati, and even some people on mainstream media can barely conceal their tragic feeling that the guy missed. But also, right up until the man pulled the trigger, there was messaging from the media and political establishment that Trump is an existential threat to democracy, that MAGA Republicans undermine the foundation of America. Joy Reid, again, the id of the Democrat Party, calling him Adolf Hitler, just flat out. So you mentioned the word stochastic. I hate using their language, but this is true. They know that they're signaling to their base that if they say this enough times, they might outsource to a crazy person the ability to pull the trigger on Trump. I'm seeing two contrasts here. There was NatCon, where it seems that people understood that there seems to be no compromise with this group of people who would rather see you dead than win an election and them to be in remission for 4 years, versus even at the RNC, where Trump is, there's still a sort of multicultural courting of various group demographics, and there's a feeling that we can all just come together and unite if we platform Amber Rose, or this sort of stuff. Do you think the American right has a grasp on this? Do you think that Trump's administration will have a grasp on where the legislation needs to go to head woke off at the pass, or do you think that they'll still be conciliatory even after there's been an attempt on his life?
Yeah, it's really interesting there. I mean, first of all, you're right. I mean, one of the things I talk about is the fact that left liberalism has these sort of three elements: guilt, sort of white male guilt, empathy towards historically marginalized groups. And the third thing is what I call fascist scare, which is this idea that we're always just one remove away from 1930s Germany or Jim Crow South or whatever, and the fascists are on the march and they're under the bed. And this is where this completely unhinged demonization of even quite milquetoast right-wing politicians and somebody like a Pierre Poilievre in Canada being called dangerous. And this is an example. So yeah, they can get away with that because the logic there is, well, because the Holocaust and Jim Crow were so bad, we're justified in being way over the top, just in case there's a sort of 1 in a zillion chance this person could be the new Hitler. And so they're allowed to completely go after this sort of slippery slope catastrophizing logic without a check.
Godwin himself, the progenitor of Godwin's law, wrote an article for the Washington Post saying, yes, it's fine to compare Trump to Hitler, don't let me stop you. Like, he fell afoul of his own law.
Right. Yeah, it seems like there is no degree of vigilance which is too high and no degree of alarmism which is too great when it comes to the cultural right. Now, what about the Republican Party? I mean, obviously they're coming up to an election. They're looking very good in the polls. The minority vote is obviously moved in their direction quite a bit, and so that's probably governing the way they're thinking. I think, however, at the same time, with J.D. Vance's appointment, he said very good things about DEI. I don't know. I think that they will, if they do not do anything about this, I think they're going to be in for a real roasting. And now, of course, we don't know what they're going to do. They didn't build the wall either last time. So, maybe they won't do anything about this. And that's going to be the question. I think Vance's appointment is a good indication in the sense he's not from that sort of economic libertarian wing that doesn't care about culture. My worry is if he gets focused too much on some of, Vance has also got ideas on economics and foreign policy, which I just think are secondary at this point. I think as long as they can keep the focus on the culture, I mean, that to me is absolutely central. I hope so, and I think so, but I'm also worried by things like Trump running down, Project 2025. And I worry that Trump's ego could get in the way, that he might not like it if someone was having policy successes and getting praise. I worry that he would step in and remove the individual. So that's the kind of thing I worry about, is that ineffectiveness.
So do you mean someone within his administration having successes, or a governor in a state? Or?
Well, someone within his administration. I mean, let's say Vance was successfully prosecuting culture war, being praised. How's Trump going to react to that? I mean, if Trump isn't getting the praise directly and Vance is, I don't know. And I just would hope that Trump will hope to pocket that gain and ride that gain, but I can't be sure. And there are certainly examples in his last administration where he did remove people who were actually pretty good and doing good things simply on the basis of, they were getting a lot of praise. So that's my worry, if I have a worry.
He is generally very good at identifying. I don't know whether this is. I don't know how sort of strategic or intellectual this is. For someone like J.D. Vance, it would be much more so. But Trump is also very good at identifying these sorts of cultural war wedge issues. But the concern is that.
Well, can he follow through? Yeah, I guess we'll see. Does he have the policy follow through? I mean, we saw with the wall. I mean, he did certainly reduce illegal immigration much more, and they did do some good things in terms of the border. They didn't, as Ann Coulter repeatedly say, they didn't build the wall.
And that matters as well, because any good things you do on immigration, aside from the wall, can just get reversed once the Democrats come into office. Yeah,
and now I guess on the culture wars, a lot of it doesn't cost the same amount of money. So hopefully just getting rid of DEI in government and pushing back in various ways in terms of funding to public bodies and universities and schools.
It's interesting that you make that point, though, about him potentially not, because the main concern that people raise with Trump on our side of things is not so much that his people who are pro-Trump and scoring successes in the cultural war will be a problem in the sense of kind of arousing a sort of envy on Trump's part, but more that the deep state will stonewall him, set its dogs upon him, and that there will be people within his administration who will breathe against him, who will leak to the New York Times, will link to the Washington Post. Do you think that he has learned his lessons from the previous 4 years in office, in which he was indeed stonewalled quite a bit?
Well, this is one reason I was worried when he talked down Project 2025, because that's an attempt to bring in some of the expertise and personnel that's going to be needed to take on that deep state. You know, if you've got to close down departments and get rid of people, you're going to need the lawyers to know their stuff, and you're going to need to get that past the courts. You're going to need to have it's quite technical to prosecute this and to do it successfully. So that would be my concern. My other concern, of course, is that he'll get bogged down in foreign policy around whether, to say, I'm the one who's going to solve Israel, I'm going to solve Ukraine, and spend all of his political capital on that. And not on domestic issues and like the border and culture war. So those are just some of my concerns. But
that's essentially what Reagan ended up doing in hindsight. I mean, he ended the Cold War, and that's his legacy cemented, fantastic. Right. But then was also responsible, at least in the state of California, for passing no-fault divorce, and did a mass amnesty on illegals, setting the stage for mass immigration after that. So
that's right.
I evaluate your fears on Trump there to be pretty well founded.
And so those are some of my fears, but I think they certainly have talked up the threat of woke, and they've talked up the culture war, certainly in Republican speeches and stuff. So I don't know. The question will also be who is going to hold them to account if they don't do anything on this.
Touching on youth politics quickly, this is at least in theory a youth show of sorts. You wrote a wonderful report for Policy Exchange. Many of the findings of which actually I believe in your book, in your book as well, and your Policy Exchange report was called The Political Culture of Young Britain. It's only about 50 or 60 pages. If people are interested, they really should read it. It's very, very revealing. But the concern, I suppose, you raised in that is that the younger generation is much more radicalized on these cultural questions than older generations. Much more likely, for example, to say that J.K. Rowling should be sort of cancelled by her publisher. Much less likely to hold people, important figures like Churchill in high acclaim. One of the causes for optimism on the right, and I suppose in the last year or so, has been what people are calling a kind of a political youthquake of sorts, particularly in France, particularly on the continent, and increasingly, potentially, now that we don't have the Conservative Party as an albatross around our neck when it comes to mobilising right-wing youth support, maybe in Britain as well. Are you more optimistic than you were a year ago on the prospects of a galvanised generation of reactionary Zoomers like Connor and me?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point you raise because if we just look at the election, it is true a third of the under 25s voted for Bardella and the RN in France. Now, across the European election, however, it is still the case. So if you take the French case, still there was, the under 25s were the most left-wing age group in France. It's just that if they are going to go to the right, they are going to go RN rather than Republican. Likewise, in this country, only 20% of the under 25s voted on the right of those who voted for a party. But it was more Reform than Tory. So they are more radical. But here's actually something quite interesting I just picked up in looking at the YouGov polling over the last 18 months. Two questions. One is single-sex bathrooms versus unisex bathrooms. And the other is, has immigration been too high? Now, if you look at the under 25s in the last 18 months, it looks like they are 20 points more conservative on both those questions. And those are the only two that I was really able to get a look at. So there's been this shift in the last 18 months on those two questions, and it's that shift amongst the older groups is not there. So is something happening in Britain in the under 25s on these issues? I am now of the view that something could be happening.
I have to point out that deprogram began exactly 18 months ago. So that
okay.
is a testament to the success that we've had. Eric, we could talk to you all day, but thank you so much for joining us on Deprogrammed again, and we'll have you back soon.
Thanks, Harrison.
Connor, thanks as ever.
Pleasure.
You've been watching Deprogrammed. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.